All right, welcome everybody. Good evening. My name is Hope Wilder and I'm with Pathfinder Community School. And welcome to our live YouTube presentation and Q&A. If you have any questions, please just type them in the chat box on the right-hand side. And at the end of a brief presentation, we'll get to the questions that you have. So I'm the founder of Pathfinder Community School, and I live in Durham. I've been in alternative education for 12 years, and Pathfinder has been my dream for about a year and a half. I went to a conference and heard Peter Gray speak, and then I read his book, Free to Learn. And since then, I just said, I need to start a school like this. I've been researching self-directed learning and Sudbury schools. I spent 2 months at Arts and Ideas Sudbury School in Baltimore, which I'll talk about more during the presentation. And I'm happy to be working with a very talented startup group, which includes Dr. Kevin Currie-Knight, who's joining us tonight. He's a teaching assistant professor in East Carolina University's College of Education. And his specialty is in philosophy and history of American education. He teaches courses on things like how learning and motivation work, and how the school's structure impacts the learning process. We're just delighted to have him as a member of Pathfinder's Advisory Committee Startup Group. And I'd like to welcome you, Kevin, to say hi to our audience tonight.
Thank you, Hope. Yeah, so I guess we should probably start the presentation. Right?
Yeah.
So while I'm doing my screen share, I guess I'll just preface by saying that what I'm going to show you is basically some evidence about how models like what Pathfinder is doing are actually pretty validated by evidence. So it's not just, if you're apprehensive or whatnot, there's actually really good data to show that models like this work. Is my screen showing up on your?
I think it's showing me.
Okay.
Okay, now I see your slideshow now.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, great. Okay, so the first place to start the presentation is for you to maybe think for a minute or so about what your most profound learning experience has been. And I usually start here because when I ask people this, and I've asked people, colleagues and kids and college students and all of this, a lot of what they mention have a similar theme. So some people talk about, when they learned a certain skill in art that kind of pushed their art to a new level. And some people mention being engrossed in books that they had to work really hard to understand, but ended up being really profound. And a few people talk about getting lost in the world of learning code, computer code and such. And so, but all of the answers that I get tend to be, include a few features. So one is that they're very intrinsically motivated. Everyone who mentions stuff that they have learned in a profound way were really motivated to do it. It wasn't something that was assigned to them. It was something that they pursued out of pure interest. It was also freely chosen. Usually it wasn't something where you had a grade or took a test afterwards. The test was simply that you learned the new skill enough that you were satisfied that you've learned it. Sometimes it was social. So oftentimes it would be talking with people or maybe interacting in a really engaging way on social media where you learn a ton from people and stuff. But namely, a lot of these experiences are not school related. And even when people do mention school related things, it was usually outside of school that they learned the thing. So it might have been talking with professors and students outside of school and stuff like that. So the reason I mention it, all of this, is because a lot of the things that we think of as the most profound learning experiences don't look like traditional education. So that right there should tell you something. And that's what this presentation is going to be about. I think we need to rethink learning, especially in spite of, I guess, in light of a lot of evidence that says the way we do it in schools traditionally don't work, and maybe the way we do it in schools like Pathfinder do tend to work. So,
Kevin, can I interrupt you for just a second?
Sure. Yes.
Because I wanted to take a moment to tell the group a little bit about Pathfinder, so that we have that to kind of anchor our experience for your talk.
Sure.
So Pathfinder Community School is going to be a self-directed school. We're going to open in fall of 2018. We're currently looking at a potential location in Durham, We're going to serve ages 5 to 18. We're looking at an annual $2.5 to $12.5 thousand a year index tuition. So that's like an income-based sliding scale. And we're currently seeking founding families and also startup group members. Our core values are freedom, respect, and community. And the way that we see those values implemented, the freedom is each student has the freedom to direct their learning. They're in charge of their choices, their actions, and their education. They also have complete self-responsibility, so they are responsible for their choices, their actions, and their education. We're very mindful of keeping that freedom balanced with safety, providing a safe environment in which kids can be free. We believe in fundamental respect for the human rights of the child. That means that all of the students consent to any activities that they're taking place in, so there's no forced classes or things like that. And we also believe in the value of cooperative governance. So students and staff working together to problem solve and figure out what are the rules that govern our interaction behavior, and how do we distribute the resources of the school according to student interest. Last but not least, community is the middle name of the school. We're really devoted to accessibility and diversity and student, staff, and family relationships. And just this last one to let you guys know, as Kevin's talking, where Pathfinder is in kind of a school, where do we fall in terms of schooling? We're right at the spot between self-directed education, which includes things like unschooling, agile learning centers, which have sprung up. There's one in New York, there's one in Charlotte, they're coming up all over the world. And democratic schools, which you might have heard of schools like the Albany Free School or Summerhill. So we're right in the middle with a lot of democratic free schools and also Sudbury schools. So when I say that word Sudbury, what I really mean is a school where there's self-directed education and there's democratic governance. So that's all I have about Pathfinder. If you want to take it back, Kevin.
Yeah, sure. So for a lot of people, some of those ideas may sound scary because they're not the way traditional schools operate. But let me show you what the research says about how humans learn as opposed to how we learn in school. So a lot of what I'm going to say is basically amounts to the idea that we've created a school system that functions almost all on extrinsic incentives, which are like grades, rewards, punishments, etc., rather than intrinsic incentives, pursuing learning because you're interested in it. So we have a school system that really is designed around extrinsic incentives. So let's start here. This is what I like to call the inconvenient truth of education. It's the idea that interest and its close cousin curiosity really are the best predictors of whether you're going to learn something deeply. So these are just a few of the research papers that point to the idea that every time it's tested, one of the best predictors of whether someone is going to be increasingly engaged, increasingly focused, and retain what they learn is basically whether they're interested in it and whether they're curious about it. And a lot of these articles also point out, conversely, that schools don't really do a good job of cultivating interest and curiosity. So let me just read you the second sentence of this article about interest from the Encyclopedia of the Sciences of Learning to give you an idea of how strong this research finding is. Both research and everyday experience tell us that people in general, and young children more specifically, become increasingly proficient in their performance when engaged in activities that are personally interesting. And you'll notice the first sentence gives a nod to the idea that schools, when we test them for interest and curiosity, tend not to do a very good job fostering this. So this is a truth, but why do I call it an inconvenient truth? Well, because as a professor in a college of education and as a former K-12 teacher myself, I can tell you that we often act as if curiosity and interest really aren't that big of a deal, or we can kind of just, kind of avoid them and find ways to make classrooms entertaining, etc. But what we really don't do is really foster interest. So it's kind of inconvenient for schools. So I hear all the time, and I have to tell my own students all the time, oh, just get to know all of your students, get to know what their interests are, and tailor every lesson to their interests. Well, when you have 20 plus students in every class you have, and you're going to have several a day, that becomes unwieldy. But also there's this thing that governs the entire school day, called the class schedule. So from 9 to 10:15 a.m., you're taking pre-algebra and you're learning pre-algebraic stuff, whether you want to or not, whether you're interested in it or not. So a lot of kids from 9 to 10:15 may not be interested in algebra. Maybe they can't stop thinking about this other thing that they want to do or that they want to learn. But we're going to force them to learn algebra from 9 to 10:15 because that's convenient. And maybe some kids don't have any interests that actually do intersect with algebra, at least not at the present time, but they might discover those interests later if they were allowed to pursue their passions. So really, school is what you call teacher-centered. It's really centered around the curriculum, not around the interests of the student. And that's why I call interest the inconvenient truth in education. The second finding that's really closely related to this, and this is another one of the strongest findings in the literature on education, is that autonomy, which is about student choice, is good for learning. Every study that I'm aware of has found that autonomy increases student motivation, so you are a lot more intrinsically motivated when you get to choose what to do. It also increases engagement with whatever it is you're learning, and it increases the retention that you learn with. So the stuff that you are able to choose and have choice over, you're going to learn better than the stuff that's just assigned to you. And I say that this is related to interest because usually the reason I suspect that autonomy is good is because when you're free to choose, you'll choose the most interesting stuff for you. But again, we can only do so much in schools the way they are with autonomy because we have a class schedule. So maybe from 9 to 10:15 when we're doing pre-algebra, the teacher could maybe allow you to choose what kind of project you want to do that's pre-algebra, or what group to work with when you're doing your project about pre-algebra, or maybe what assignments you want to do, what worksheet you want to do, etc. Like that's a pretty trivial kind of autonomy. And Pathfinder and schools like it are incorporating a lot more deep autonomy. So it's not just choosing who you're going to work with, but you have to do pre-algebra. It's choosing what you want to learn, and if it's pre-algebra, awesome, and if it's something else, awesome. And Hope has some really good analogies about this in her travels to some schools that I'd like to hear about.
Yeah, for sure. So I spent 2 months at Earth Ideas in Baltimore, and there I saw so much learning happening all the time that was so completely outside of the box. So these are just a few photos from my time at A&I. And on the left, you'll see a girl who is intently focused on a self-directed project that she chose, which as she described to me when I was just like, hey, what are you doing? She said, actually she came up to me and she said, where are the saws? And I was like, okay, I'll go get you some tools in the basement. I know where they are. What do you need it for? And she was like, I'm building a secret garden. I was like, that sounds great. So she had a bunch of friends with her. There's actually somebody holding the other end of the board there in the photo who teamed up to help build this secret garden. And there were times when it kind of mystified me exactly what they meant by that, but they were intensely engaged in building, cutting, painting, reconfiguring, arguing, talking about for days at a time. I think it was actually about over a week that they were building on that. Then on the right, you'll see the lovely picture of Animal and some other Muppets was from some kids who hang out in a room upstairs where they have all these great whiteboards. They had just gotten new whiteboard markers, and one of the students spent days making these Muppet amazing detailed murals, and his friends were sitting around watching him make these murals, and they're giving comments and saying, oh, you should put this character here, you should put that character there. And then the third group, really when students have free choice, a lot of what they do is play, and what it looks like running and tagging and Nerf guns and Minecraft, and above all, talking, interacting, being with people. So that's just a small slice of the kinds of things that go on at a self-directed school.
So it's worth asking, Hope, because it might transition into what I'm going to say next. Let's take the girl who's building the secret garden. How long in one sitting would you say is the longest she has spent on that activity in one sitting?
I'd say probably around 3 or 4 hours. Okay. I know I definitely saw her go there and just stay until she got hungry and it was time to eat.
Right, right. And I'm betting the same would probably be true for, the folks who are drawing the mural and things like that.
Oh, I never saw them take the marker off the whiteboard. They were obsessed.
Yeah. So this is going to dovetail actually really well with what I'm going to say next, which is research involving a psychological phenomenon that's called flow. It sounds really new agey. It's not necessarily that. So a psychologist named Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi in the 1980s and late 70s noticed something really curious about humans. For a lot of the day, we're kind of passive and we do what we have to do and we get tasks over with and all this. But he said, when you look at humans doing what they really like to do, all of that goes out the window. They're laser focused. They lose track of time. They're so engrossed in some really difficult activity that they just lose track of time and all. And I'm sure that we've all had this, whether it's, playing chess, reading a book, playing tennis, learning something new that we really like. And so he studied this phenomenon that he calls flow, which is people really being completely involved in an activity, just completely engrossed. And this is a really key thing because we generally call flow optimal experience, and there's a reason why. Flow is deep concentration in one activity, and it tends to be kind of your optimal experience. We've all had this kind of idea. And there's a lot of research showing that while flow is a really important state for people to be in, both just for their own happiness, but also for learning, that again, schools are not very good places to achieve flow. So one of the classic studies of flow is in the late 80s, they gave students beepers. This was the late 80s, so cell phones really weren't a thing yet. And what they did is they beeped students periodically throughout their days, before school, after school, during school, in the evenings, etc. And they asked students to describe what they're doing and how engaged they were. And the engagement, sadly, was the most lacking during the school hours. Usually flow activities happened after school. And from all of this research, Csikszentmihalyi was able to boil down several elements of flow, several things that need to happen for flow to exist. And it's really worth talking about three of them really quickly. First of all, for flow to exist, you need a high level of concentration. Secondly, you need an altered perception of time. So people in flow states often lose track of time. A minute will feel like an hour, or 3 hours will feel like 5 minutes. Also, flow activities tend to be autotelic, which means self-directed. And the reason I bring these three up is because, again, given schools with their class schedules and their time limits and things aren't really good at producing these things. So high levels of concentration are hard to achieve in a school day, particularly because most people, when they do things in school, are really concerned with grades rather than the activity itself. And it's hard to get really concentrated when you're focused on an extrinsic incentive like a grade. Altered perception of time is really difficult in school because, let's face it, we have class schedules. You can only be involved in an activity for the amount of time of a class period, and that's not a lot of time. You really need a lot more time generally to develop a good flow state. And obviously, most activities in school aren't self-directed. So this is yet another reason I think that schools like Pathfinder have an edge, because they do allow for flow experiences in school. And again, Hope has seen a lot of these. We've heard about a few of them, but she has some other examples of kind of flow states that she's seen in schools.
Yeah, so at ANI, when I was there this spring, I met this remarkable young man whose name is Matt, and he was one of 3 graduates this year from Arts and Ideas. He came into the Sudbury School, I think 4 years ago or 5 years ago, when he was 13. And he was very disaffected, disillusioned, and basically he was intending to drop out of school because he was so completely uninterested in the classes. He said he was just bored out of his skull. And the thing he would do is come home and listen to angry punk music. I mean, it's like a very typical teenage situation. His dad said to him, just out of curiosity, if you were going to invent a school for yourself, what would it be? And he said, I don't think this really exists, but if there were no classes and there were no grades and there was no homework and I could do whatever I wanted and I could just play guitar all day. And his dad said, well, I think I've found the school for you. It's called Arts and Ideas. So Matt came to the school, and that play guitar all day is exactly what he did. On the right, you'll see he was standing in line when I took that photo for Hot Lunch Friday, and he's playing guitar and singing a song. So Matt started out as an amateur. He was just playing around. He watched things on YouTube. He kept playing guitar. He played bass. He started playing bass in a band. And eventually he was like, despite myself, I got really good. He's a very talented musician and songwriter. And he writes these deep, soulful, poignant, interesting songs that are very moving. And he's now a confident, competent performer. He performs all over Baltimore. And he, in his final year at A&I, he started taking classes at community college because he had an interest and a passion for poetry. Songwriting was like a gateway that led him into language, and not just music, but also literature. And he took all these classes. He did great. He had a fabulous GPA because he wanted to be there. He was hungry for the knowledge that the teachers had to share with him. And he got into Goucher College, which is a very small and fairly exclusive in their admissions liberal arts college in Baltimore that's just delighted to have him as a student. So I see him as a real success story, and also somebody who, just to show how far people can go if they're allowed to pursue their interest, what kind of levels of mastery they can achieve.
Great. Yeah, and I think that's another illustration of kind of the another important element of flow activities that Csikszentmihalyi points out is that they have amazing ability to kind of get us excited about things. There is a book that I read recently in some research. I know the author's last name is Damon. It's called The Path to Purpose. And this author was really concerned that a lot of students getting out of even high school and even college don't seem to have an idea of purpose. And Csikszentmihalyi's research about flow really shows that flow activities themselves, as in this case, can really give people purpose that they never had before. So here's a student who is really disengaged, and when he's allowed to pursue music as a passion, not only does it kind of give him a purpose, but it also engages him in other things like poetry. So another thing to talk about here is that at schools like Pathfinder, there are learning is a lot more of a natural process. In school, it's a pretty artificial process. So in school, it looks like this. We learn something first, then we assess it, taking a test or doing a project, and then we attach a grade to it. And this is actually really difficult because it doesn't look like anything like what learning usually looks like in real life. So if you go back to thinking about your most authentic and profound learning experiences, you probably didn't learn something first in terms of an isolated kind of curriculum. Then you take a test on it, and then you grade it. So think about the girl who's building the secret garden. She's not learning a curriculum first and then taking a test on it. First of all, her test is whether or not it works. And that's true for most things. The test of most things is whether or not it works. If you're learning computer code, you don't take a test on it. You figure out whether the code you're writing works. That's your test. And you don't learn first and then take a test. You often learn while you're testing yourself. So, if you look at how people learn language normally, they learn while speaking. They don't learn first and then speak. They speak, and then they learn to speak while they're speaking. So you come to something you don't know while you're doing an activity, you learn it, then you come back to the activity. It doesn't really look a whole lot like school. And the assessment process is a pretty artificial process because, the idea of teach to the test, well, that often happens in school. If I'm giving you a certain kind of test, that's going to shape how you learn something. But there's also a really problematic aspect with the idea of grades. We think of grades as this kind of necessary thing to make sure people learn stuff. And the idea is that grades are awesome because they can get people to learn stuff they wouldn't already learn, and the learning would kind of follow because you're trying to get the grade. Okay, so there's a researcher named Denise Pope who followed around some high school students in a book she did called Doing School. And these are really well-performing high school students, like A and B students. And her goal in this is to figure out what they're doing that makes them learn so well, because they're A and B students, so obviously they must be learning really well. And she finds out, hence the title Doing School, that it's not that they learned well, it's that they got really good at getting good grades. And that's really different from learning. So you can get good grades in a whole lot of ways. I mean, the most blatantly obvious is to cheat without learning. But you can also do things like figure out how to take tests really well, or figure out how to cram information in your head. You study the night before, you dump it out the next day. People get really good at this. So she found that a lot of students really got through school without having to really do the necessary learning. And it was because they were shooting for grades, not learning. So when you take grades away, it means students learn kind of for its own sake, because there's no extrinsic grade motivator there. So Hope has a few kind of anecdotes here about kind of what happens when you don't have grades and tests and things like that. What do students learn?
Yeah, they learn all kinds of things, and some of those things do, some of those things fit into our idea of what learning is, and some of them are not, as I would say they're more outside the box. So primarily people are learning about relationships, they're learning about themselves, they're learning about what they love, and they're learning about what they love to do. But academic type learning does happen along the way. Kids learn to read even when they're not given instruction to read, and they learn at different times, but they do all learn to read. There has never been a Sudbury graduate who has graduated without learning to read. And not only do they read at their age level, they tend to catch up very quickly, and then to read beyond their age level. Similarly with math, I have a couple examples here for math. At ANI, there with the Hot Lunch Fridays that I mentioned, a group of students was in charge of planning the meal together, buying the ingredients from a set budget, cooking the meal, selling the meal, setting the prices for all the food. Then if they make a profit, they have more money to fold into the next Hot Lunch Friday. If they operate at a loss, they have to hold a bake sale or something to make it up, because they need money to buy the ingredients to make the food. They're learning by experience in terms of what's popular. Sushi night was extremely popular, but then spaghetti was less so. And similarly, on the right, you can see students are allowed to have their own businesses. So this was a student who, Philip, was selling organic lollipops. And then I think this is competition, which was 25 cents for a whole bag of M&Ms. Buy 4, get 1 free. So here we have reading, we have writing, we have arithmetic, but it is not in a class. You have to do math to keep track of your money, and you're invested in it because money is valuable. So there's economics, there's business, there's personal interaction, there's planning, there's forethought. All of those things are combined in these real life, holistic, integrated learning experiences where students are learning about things that are important to them.
Great. So the last thing I want to talk about, and I'll spend only a few minutes on it so we can get to question and answer, is that learning really is a social process. And in schools, despite the fact that schools make good efforts to try to make learning social, learning tends to look something like this. The students are kind of facing the teacher. The teacher is the one who dispenses the information. Students can work in groups and stuff, but only really at the teacher's direction. They can do certain things, but only at the teacher's direction. And it's actually really inefficient if you think about it, because in any given classroom, let's say there's 20 students, 1 teacher. If the teacher is the only one who's allowed to dispense information and share information, and the conversation really is one way, students ask and teachers answer, that means the teacher is the only one who's allowed to share their knowledge. What learning should look like is something like this, where you have students, instead of teachers, I have uppercase S for staff members, because that's what exists at schools like Pathfinder, and even media sources. So instead of one teacher being the only one who can know in front of the room, everyone's allowed to share information with everyone else. So if you need information, you can ask people. You can find out who knows that information. There's been several authors who have studied how this works on peer-to-peer networks, especially social networks. So a book I'm a big fan of is Douglas Thomas and John Seeley Brown wrote a book called The New Culture of Learning, where they talk about how video game forums are great learning experiences for video gamers. And the reason they are that is because no one is the sole person who can dispense with knowledge. everyone comes in, maybe they know a certain thing, maybe they want to know a certain thing, and there's a plethora of people who they can ask, and they can share information with whoever has that information, and other people can benefit from the information that they have. And that's not really possible in a traditional classroom, because the only person who's allowed to share information is a teacher. So again, Hope has some really good examples of how this sort of peer-to-peer sharing works pretty naturally in a school like Pathfinder.
All right, so I saw so much talking and asking for help happening between students when they were engaged in something that they were interested in. On the left, there's a group of young people who are playing Minecraft, which is very popular and involves a lot of abstract thinking and problem solving. And then on the right, we have a very typical scene, which is a group of teens and adults engaging around a cell phone or another device that's being used as a portal to the outer world, kind of the world of information. So an example that I saw of this kind of learning that was really great to me was I was sitting on a couch, and a student was on their phone. They're kind of flipping through the internet. I had no idea what they were looking at. And they said to the room at large, just all of a sudden they said, "Hey, what's the stock market?" This was like maybe a 15-year-old. And I was sitting there and I was all ready to jump in with my Econ 101 kind of talk. But his neighbor, who is 13, said, well, the stock market is where you keep your investments. And when it's going up, it's good because that means you're making money. And when it's going down, that's bad because it means you're losing money. And he just said, okay. And he went back to reading. And that was a really interesting moment to me, because I saw that sometimes if you learn what you want to know right now, you will actually progress much further than if you are, that same student could have sat through hours and hours of classes about the stock market and never really understood what it was because he didn't want to know. But he found out in that moment, and not from a teacher or an adult, but just from a peer who happened to have the piece of information that he was looking for. And the other thing that really struck me was I could not imagine a 15-year-old in a high school class raising their hand and admitting they didn't know what the stock market was, because ignorance is so intolerable in school. I find in my years of education and teaching that the shame that I found around the students, especially older students, when they didn't know something was just horrifying. And for me, it was so refreshing to be in an environment where anybody could ask any question at any time and nobody would make fun of them for not knowing. And there's no expectation that hey, you should already know that, because all of us have things that we know a lot about and we have things that we don't know as much about. That attitude of being open and curious and interested in the world to be much more refreshing.
Yeah. So why don't
I like how you put the M's among the S's. I see that as mentors and students, and I would say that role of mentor and student.
Actually, actually the M is for media. So small S is for students, large S is for staff members, not teachers, and M is for media. And the reason I put that there is because we're really reaching an age where it's no longer the case that that teachers are scarce. Teachers are all around you. You can just Google them.
All right, so we're going to transition to the Q&A. I think you've got some book recommendations for us. We've had a couple of questions in the sidebar.
Great.
I just wanted to encourage anybody who's been being shy, feel free to type your questions in at this time. And I wanted to give you just a moment, Kevin, for any closing remarks.
I think why don't we get to the questions in the interest of time. I'm just trying to figure out how to unshare my screen.
Okay, then I'll work on unsharing my screen too.
There it is.
So let's see, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And the first question, let's see, are we both up there?
I think so.
My screen isn't displaying everything that I'm seeing. All right, So the first question is, what are we looking for in founding families for Pathfinder? So this is a question for me. So basically, we're looking for people who are really excited about the concept, who want to create a real world community around the school before we begin. Of course, we want to start, our goal is to start with between 30 and 60 students in the fall of 2018. And so far, we've had a lot of interest, but I think it's such a long time away that some people, they don't know if they have the job that they need, or maybe they're going to move. A year out is a long time, or they've looked for other educational opportunities for their child in the meantime. So really what we're looking for is families who want to be there. We're looking for families who care about their children and who want to create a community and want to create a new school. So I'd say the door is wide open. Just come to our meetings. Please come to our meetings. We're looking at this time, we're trying to bridge the gap between sort of online relationships and real world relationships. All right. The next question, I'm gonna punt to you first, Kevin, just to give me a little more time to think about it.
Sure.
And the question is essentially about wasting time. The question is from Tom, and he says, often parents are concerned that a self-directed education translates to kids doing nothing but flitting their days away with mindless entertainment. Can you address this concern?
Oh, sure. Sure. So, I mean, in my own experience watching kids and others, we often think that's what kids are going to do because we gives kids so much structure that when they do get free time, they do put it on entertainment. I mean, think about it. When you come home and kind of decide to flip on the TV and kind of, let your mind rest for a bit, it's usually because you've had a lot of a structured day and et cetera. But what usually happens if you give kids a lot more freedom to actually do stuff throughout the day and follow their own interests throughout the day, they might whittle away a little bit of time at first, but it gets old after a while. One thing I know about kids, especially because I have a 15-month-old son at home, was making it glaringly evident that kids from a very young age have a very low tolerance for boredom. They don't like to be bored. So there's only so much time you can spend watching TV before you get bored. And now you're going to go do something else because now you want some sort of novelty, so you go somewhere else. And at some point what happens is you kind of stumble upon things that are engaging, that are challenging. And when you watch kids in their natural environment, just watch them in their natural environment. Go outside, watch what kids are doing. It's very rare that they're being passive. They're creating something. They're engaged with something. They're building something. And we really know this about kids from a very young age to an older age. There's a video online, if you look up the Independent Project in Massachusetts, a school that gives teenagers a lot of freedom to design their own learning, and you find them being engaged in stuff. You don't find them being passive. So I think that answers kind of the question from my perspective, what I've seen of kids, but I'd like to hear your answer also, Hope.
Yeah, I would love to. It's a very common concern, and I think especially in our very productivity focused culture that's values work more than play, and also doesn't value downtime in general for anyone. But I think especially when we see our children doing something that we see as a waste of time, that there's just a lot of hangups about that. The first thing I would say is that thankfully we're connected to a very broad coalition, the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, and people have been doing self-directed education in school environments like Sudbury schools for 50 years now. And in unschool environments, the unschooling movement really got going in the 70s. So we have years and years and years of people who are now adults who have been raised in this model, and we can study them and see that they have successful lives. They get into college if they want to get into college. 89% of Sudbury Valley graduates get into the first college of their choice. That's nearly 90%. That's an amazing percentage. And when interviewed, they say that their lives have meaning to them and that they're employed in work that they care about. So it's not just about a paycheck. But I would say that also from all these people who have experienced that every student who enters self-directed education from traditional education goes through at least a year of what they call detoxing or deschooling. And in that year of deschooling, the student doesn't do anything. So this is they lie on the couch, they sleep, they play video games all day. And often when that happens, the parents are terrified because they're saying, what have I done? My child is wasting their life. They're lazy. They're not going to be able to get the skills they need to be an adult. But really, schooling is very stressful, and kids need time to decompress from it. Once they've had that time to detox, then they get bored, like Kevin is saying, and then they look for things to do. And while they learn what to do, there's this concept of wasting time. You know, they might be daydreaming, they might be thinking, they might be forming new relationships. They're also learning about learning. And to me, most fundamentally, they're learning about the core of themselves. So one Sudbury graduate that I heard speak after she got into college said that at college, she had no problem with the classes because she knew why she was there and she knew what she wanted to get out of it. She knew what she wanted to do with her life. And she said, when I turn around to my friends, they have problems that they don't know what to do with their day if it's not scheduled for them. They don't know what to do with their week. They don't know what to do with their month. They don't know what to do with their life. That's this kind of existential problem of who am I and why am I in the world, that if you've never had to face that problem because your time has been structured for you, it's really a shock once you leave. For me, it was when I first left college that I really had to face that, that kind of who am I and what do I want to do with my life, the big questions. Students who are self-directed are facing that question every minute of every day. So every minute saying, who am I right now? What do I want to do with this minute? And the last thing that I would say about wasting time is, whose time is it anyway? Once kids turn 18, they're magically an adult, and we say, you know, go off, make mistakes in the world. But if we've never allowed them the time to make their own choices, how do we expect them to make responsible choices? How do we expect them to use their time wisely if they haven't had practice using their time the whole time? So the way that I see what we're doing at Pathfinder is we're giving time back to children. I believe that children are fully autonomous human beings, that yes, they need support, they need help, they're not fully developed. But I feel that if we give them back their time, we give them back their power, we give them back their lives, then they'll be prepared to be amazing people in the world. I'm just so excited to meet the people that they're going to be.
One last thing I should say about that very quickly, in the idea of wasting time, we also need to consider what types of activities we're thinking about students wasting time with, so to speak. There's a really good book by an author named Stephen Johnson called Everything That's Bad Is Good for You. And he's going to try to convince us that a lot of things, from watching TV to playing video games, are actually very complicated activities, and especially video games. So when I hear parents say, well, what about kids who play video games? One of the things I like to say is that I'm not sure that we undersell video games in terms of how difficult they are. So think about even the academic skills that end up being involved in playing a lot of video games. So you need a lot of math, first of all, because you have to calculate how many tokens you need to get that sword that's going to kill the dragon at the end. You need, obviously, to strategize. You need oftentimes reading skills. Students will stumble across reading because they need reading for video games. But there's a lot of problem-solving skills. You keep in mind subplots that are going on during the video game. A lot of video games are quite complicated. So I would even question whether some of those things, like playing video games, end up being wasting time. I think they're often learning activities that are kind of in disguise.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So the next question is for me, and the question is, what qualifications are you looking for in staff? So in staff, we're looking for a deep understanding of the educational model and a deep and profound respect for children as human beings. I find that we've gotten a lot of interest from folks who are within the current educational system, which is actually a big minus, because we find that you need to take time, if you're going to spend time around kids in this unschooled way, you need to take time to unschool or deschool yourself. It's very easy to slip into an adultist mindset of I know best, and to step in and interfere with students when they have a conflict rather than letting them take a stab at working it out first, that kind of thing. And then third, probably willingness to work for glory more than pay. I'm really committed to paying a living wage, but we're going to be working on a very tight budget. So that should be in the expectations for any would-be staff members. And then the last but not least is we're going to be looking first at people who have been doing concrete work to actually get the school started, mostly because those people will be a known quantity, but also because just the sweat labor shows actual commitment to the project, and it's work, talk is cheap, basically. And we'll be hiring in May of 2016, so we're still a little bit of a ways out. Now, the next question I have is for Kevin, and it says, Kevin, what would you say to parents who are concerned that their student may miss getting a broad education, preparation for adulthood, etc., if they're focused on specific and personal interests?
Sure. There's a few responses possible to that. So there is a fair amount of data in the educational literature that says if you're concerned that your children in this model may not get all the things that other kids are getting in a traditional school, you should be concerned about traditional school as well, because when those students are tested after they leave traditional school, they retain a fraction of what they've gotten in their traditional schooling. So I think it would be a mistake to say that since traditional schools teach a broad range of stuff, that thereby students end up leaving with a broad range of stuff. Again, students retain a fraction of that. I guess I would also potentially question, and this is my personal belief, I would question how broad a skills students necessarily need to have in today's world. The way I usually put it is I think students need to be adaptable, but not necessarily that they need to be broad in terms of their array of knowledge. And the reason I say that is that it's becoming increasingly easier to learn what you should know when you need to know it. And in fact, that's the way most learning takes place. You don't learn something 5 years ago and then recall it when you need to know it. You learn it and retain it best when you learn it because you need to know it. So maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, it might have been the case that school needs to prepare you with all this factual knowledge, because if you need something, it's going to be really hard to look it up and you're just going to need to recall it from your school experience. That's less and less and less true by the year. So I think really the skills that the school like Pathfinder teaches are learning how to learn. So these kids come out of school maybe not knowing all the stuff that they need to know when they need to know it, but they learn how to learn stuff. So when they find something they need to know, it's relatively easier for them than it is for kids who went through a traditional model to learn stuff as they need, to learn stuff as they need to do it. So hopefully that makes sense as an answer, but I would really challenge the idea that students, number one, in traditional schools are getting all of the stuff that is being taught, and secondly, that students really need to know a whole bunch of factual stuff when they leave school.
All right, thank you, Kevin. We've got another question for you that made me smile because we've talked about this before. Kevin, I'm curious how working in the college education system works for you, given that it's not the ideal learning environment for most students.
Yeah, so well, here's a bit about my background and kind of how I came to the belief system that I have now. It's been a process. So I was a K-12 teacher first. I was a college teacher second. Throughout all of that, throughout the first several years of those processes, I was a relatively traditional teacher. Learning happens in school. I, kind of give my lecture and I give the information and students listen. And if they don't retain the information, it's because maybe partly I didn't do my job right, but partly students need to try harder to pay attention, all that stuff. So I teach courses largely about how learning works. So one of my jobs is to teach future teachers what the literature says about how learning works. And more, semester to semester, I got to the point where I started thinking what I'm teaching them and what they're going to go into in schools are two very different things. For instance, I'm teaching students of mine about the value of giving students choice, the value of autonomy in education. Again, that's one of the strongest findings we have. The more choice you give students, the better they end up doing motivationally and all that stuff. And we would get to a point in class where they would say, so how do we do that in the schools that we're going into? And we would kind of start to figure out ways that we could kind of do it a little bit, but it became really obvious that schools obviously set a limit in terms of how much you can really give students autonomy. So I look at my job this way. My job is to teach students the literature about how learning occurs and get them thinking about learning and get them thinking about the principles of how learning should best work. What they do with that information is up to them. Obviously, I accept the idea that a lot of them are going to go into public schools and maybe they can change things in those public schools. Maybe they can kind of do as good a job as can be done with the restrictions that schools operate under. But no, there's a part of me that really wants to tell students that if you're concerned with how learning really works and what literature says, you should also be looking at options outside of the conventional schooling system.
All right, thank you, Kevin. So the next question is from Kate, and she says, I'm wondering about the staff being trained to help my son with his insulin dosages. He has type 1 diabetes. And I'm not very familiar with type 1 diabetes. There was a co-staff member at the last school that I was at, Arts and Ideas, who is a type 1 diabetic. And so I saw her dealing with blood sugar, and she has an alert dog to help her know when she's about to crash. I would say that student safety is our first priority. Staff will be fully empowered to be adults in the legal sense of the word and in terms of kind of the sense of guardianship for the students. I wish I was more knowledgeable about what's involved in that, but I think if it's something that could be trained to a person who is there, and if your son was given some sense of accountability about the insulin in terms of if he has a timer to set, the whole thing about our educational model is giving the students as much responsibility as possible. On the other hand, if there's a safety issue, like if he forgets to come get his insulin, he could go into a life-threatening situation. That's not a situation where we would let that not happen, if that makes sense. But I've seen good things with kids using timers to kind of take control over starting a process that then an adult has to help them with. Yeah. And she says he needs reminders. Okay. Yeah. So just like I said, we would work with him to make sure that he got his health needs met, basically. So that is it for the questions that we have on our live chat. And I'm just wondering, Kevin, if you have any final thoughts, burning things to get off your chest to wrap things up in the next 5 minutes.
I guess I'll go to book recommendations. I don't have my slides up, but I can give you the names of 3 books. I know we went over a ton of stuff, so people who are interested in this model and they want to find out more, but they want time to kind of process it on their own, there's 3 books that I would recommend. The first I know is one that Hope read, and I think you mentioned Peter Gray. There's a psychologist named Peter Gray who wrote a book called Free to Learn. And his book is largely about the importance of free time and play in child development and how schools kind of, in some ways, systematically disallow a lot of the things that we know are good in terms of learning experiences. So there's that book. It's a great book to read. Another one is by an author named John Holt, who was a teacher and then an educational critic. And he wrote a book called How Children Learn, which is a sequel to another book called How Children Fail. How children fail is about the constraints of the school system that get in the way of students' progress. And how children learn is kind of the more positive part about, well, here's how children actually learn. So he looks at a whole bunch of children outside of a school setting, and he starts to explore like how they actually learn in a non-school environment. The last book is a book by a more modern, kind of educational thinker named Will Richardson, and he wrote a book called Freedom to Learn, which is a really brief but really good book that, again, looks at the difference between what we know about how learning best takes place and how learning takes place in school and all the constraints of school that in some ways inadvertently get in the way of good learning. And, you know, I guess I should also point out that neither I nor any of these authors are saying that schools are deliberately horrible places or that any, you know, school designers just don't care about kids. I think a lot of the decisions about why schools are the way they are made for political reasons without really thinking about, but what does literature really say about how students learn? Because if you look at the literature, and I have, it becomes pretty obvious that the fewer constraints we have on students' freedom, the better. They need support, they need guidance, they need people there to kind of help them when they want help. But other than that, we should really let kids learn kind of in a more natural way.
All right, thank you, Kevin. A couple more last-minute questions have come in. One is logistical. Would Pathfinder run on a traditional schedule? And the answer is yes. We're planning to run on the Durham Public School traditional scale. Thank you for that correction.
I mean, you also have to think about, I mean, you're also going to have to run in accord with North Carolina law, right? In terms of like, you know, the number of hours a student would have to spend there per week, so to speak.
Yes,
right?
So in accordance with the NC truancy laws, we're required for students to have 5 hours of attendance a day, 5 days a week. We'd like to have, there's kind of an educational loophole if people are licensed registered homeschoolers. So our homeschool workaround is that we allow 4 days a week attendance for ages 7 and up for registered homeschoolers, but only Monday through Thursday. Then we're having half-time scaled tuition for ages 5 to 7. And that's all so that we can operate as a school, and also because the democratic environment, there's a lot of problem solving that comes with conflict resolution, I would say, and also how to distribute resources. And in my view, and in the view of a lot of people at the schools that I've worked with, consistent attendance is necessary for that kind of community building, problem solving, and democratic process. Then the next question, or really it's more of a comment, says, seems like what you two are saying is that self-directed education is more about supporting students to develop themselves than acquiring a certain set of information. And I would say exactly that. Now I want to wrap out, and I'm going to post some links on the chat that we've got here, and I just want to refer everybody to pathfindercommunityschool.com, where hopefully you will find answers there to logistical questions like our tuition, location, and hours, which is on our project details page, and also more further reading, links, book recommendations, articles, and so on and so forth. There are also ways that you can plug in, sign up for our newsletter, so you get updates as soon as we know something about whether we have a location or that kind of thing. If it's set, you'll be the first to know. And I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. And I'd like to thank you, Kevin. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, it was. Thank you. I really urge everyone to kind of look at this model and think of it as almost like a paradigm shift. If you're used to thinking about traditional schooling and the constraints there, you know, do some research, read some of the books that I mentioned and some other things. And I think you'd be surprised by how well a model like this works and how viable it is.
All right. Thanks again. And I'm going to stop the broadcast and say good night, everyone.
Good night.